Brilliant. So thank you very much for joining Sikh Human Rights Group's podcast with Professor Hassan Kaya and Dr. Jasdev Rai. Professor Kaya, could I please ask you to introduce yourself and to tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in the past and are currently doing in South Africa on promoting Indigenous knowledge systems and the importance of diversity?
Thank you very much, Carlos. My name is Hassan Kaya. I am the director of the Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. It is a partnership of 5 higher education institutions in South Africa, and the way the institutions are located and their composition is very, very relevant to the topic of diversity, because the institutions are located in diverse cultural, linguistic, and ecological settings, which allows us to conduct comparative research and the complementarity of Indigenous knowledge systems across cultures, Indigenous languages, and ecosystems within our focus areas of traditional medicine, food security, environmental management and climate change, biodiversity, and also Indigenous knowledge systems, curriculum development, and studies. If you look at, for instance, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which is the hub, because as I said, it's composed of 5 higher education institutions. University of KwaZulu-Natal, the hub, is predominantly Zulu speaking, with the largest Indian community outside India, along the Indian Ocean. If you look at Northwest University, as part of our center, is located in the Northwest province, predominantly Tswana speaking, is the same arid area. If you look at UNISA, is in Gauteng province, mixed cultural and linguistic communities in an urban environment. Universities of Limpopo and Venda. Limpopo has a diversity of ethnic and linguistic groups and ecosystems. So you find that the location and in terms of culture groups and ecosystems provides us with an opportunity to do diverse research, human capital development. So if we have a focus on a particular area, like say traditional medicine, which is diverse, the cultural, linguistic diversity and the ecosystems allows us to do comparative study. And we combine our different experiences in terms of diversity in looking for a particular social practice or social challenge, which has also some global implications. And also another important aspect, the institutions are also involved in the introduction of IKS research in a multi-interdisciplinary fashion at all levels, both under and postgraduate levels. So it also gives students and researchers opportunity to learn from the different locations of the institutions in a diversity of cultures and ecosystems. And also what we have done also here is promoting cultural diversity in terms of culture and races. If you look at South Africa here, is composed of different races and cultures. So we have a project we are doing called the Triple Heritage, because South Africa is a home composed of representatives of people from Asia, Africa, and Europe with different cultures, whatever. So there's a complementarity of knowledge systems, and as we always propagated is the fact that instead of looking at cultural diversity as a problem or racial diversity as a problem, we look at these diversities as an asset, where now we have COVID-19, how the different cultures and races come together, share experiences according to their cultural diversity in mitigating a common problem. And also another important aspect we are doing, which is also has an implication on the question of cultural and biodiversity, is the institutionalization of IKS, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and also doing in our partner institutions, the introduction of IKS policy to promote the cultural and ecological specificity of knowledge systems in core business of the institution in terms of research, teaching, learning, community engagement. So by institutionalizing IKS, the different institutions, which as I said before, they are cultural and ecologically differently located, by the SHARE comparative research and human capital development, we are able to promote the significance of diversity in terms of culture and biodiversity and also spiritual aspects. And also another important aspect in the question of cultural diversity is that the CIKS, the hub, we formed an African Indigenous Knowledge Systems Institutes under UNESCO Category 2, which is composed of different cross-cultural, linguistic, regional, multidisciplinary institutions across the continent. On the 29th of January, we had the visual signing of the consortium of the African institutions and autonomous research institutions across the continent, from Lusophone, from French-speaking countries, from Anglophone, and all these countries, almost more than 11 African countries signed this consortium so that we promote research, human capital development from across cultures and across linguistic diversities and ecosystems. Yeah. So you see that our activities is a Center of Indigenous Knowledge Systems, and now as an institute in Indigenous Knowledge System, we promote the virtues of cultural and biodiversity. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Kaya. That was extremely insightful and thought-provoking. Dr. Rai, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that Sikh Human Rights Group has been doing over the years to promote pluralistic views of the environment and diversity?
Okay. Right. My name is Jasdev Rai. I am the director of Sikh Human Rights Group. This was set up in 1985. And I'm also a medical doctor and otolaryngologist. I think being a doctor also helps me to understand diversity. While the human body is the same in many ways, the way people approach problems and illnesses and express themselves are often very different. So there is a background of having dealt with a diversity of approaches to trying to diagnose illnesses and diseases from people with different cultural backgrounds. The Sikh Human Rights Group in 1993 at the World Conference on Human Rights at Vienna took a wider perspective and went for things like diversity, inclusiveness of NGOs within the UN system, and even started looking at environment. And we pushed a great deal on diversity and environment in the 1997 and 98. And we participated in the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, where our slogan was that racial parity is meaningless without culture parity. We had started that a year before in London. And by the time the World Conference happened in Durban, it became a major issue. Many countries took it up, and it became sort of, I think, nearly 25 to 30% of the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action concentrate on culture diversity. We also introduced the idea of diversity as a natural phenomenon and the need to move on from anti-racism, anti-discrimination, but to make people more comfortable with diversity so that people are not always competing or going to the law for attaining their rights or to be respected. In the 2002 World Conference on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, we felt that the concentration of the UN Sustainable Development was too focused on either a scientific or a rational, or what UN calls rational approach, and that cultures have a far bigger influence on people's attitudes towards both other people and other societies and towards the environment. And we introduced the issue of sustainable development, and religions. And we held this first conference in India, in North India, and then we held it in Johannesburg. And after that, it's become quite a major thing in many parts of the United Nations system in making both religions and cultures inclusive. At the Human Rights Group, when we were invited to a conference in Bangkok in 2008, when the Secretary General was thinking of setting up a universal ethics of environment, our position was that it's very difficult to get a universal ethics because different cultures have different approaches to the environment. Some have an ethnocentric approach. Some have a cosmocentric approach. Some have a biocentric approach. And if we allow different communities and cultures to develop their own ethical value systems, but concentrate on the goals, we would have a far bigger input from civil society and ownership of the environment and sustainable development issues by civil society. And so our concentration has been on that, and the committee that was set up by the Secretary General of the UN to set up the universal ethics also accepted our argument and dropped the idea and said, accepted our essential argument that the UN should be concentrating on goals, such as reducing carbon by, say, 2% or 1% or whatever, and letting communities develop their own ethical system. Then I was fortunate enough to meet Professor Kaya, and we found that we had similar sort of approaches. And there was this wonderful Indigenous Knowledge System department at KwaZulu University in Durban. And they were already doing some of the work in this. And we had a number of conferences there. The Sikh Human Rights Group then suggested the idea of setting up conferences and networks in different parts of the world. For instance, in Africa, we thought it would be a good idea to develop an African a convention on ethics of environment and sustainable development. There have been a few conferences held on that, which would be based on indigenous knowledge systems and philosophies of Africa, such as Ubuntu. We also held some conferences in India in which we were able to get the Indian dharmic systems, sometimes misunderstood as religious systems, but dharmic system, to look at the possibility of a South Asian ethics of environment or dharmic ethics of environment and sustainable development. And we had a conference in Malaysia on the Islamic value systems in environment. We had some inputs in Japan, and we are trying to persuade South America and Southeast Asia to set up similar sort of systems. So our focus basically is that the environment and the climate issues are far more important than to be playing hegemonic politics. To say where things are coming from, or that it's on, that we all have to be rational, as scientists say. Cultures play an important part, and if you want civil society to take ownership of the environment and the climate, then we have to speak to the language that most influences them, the value systems that most influence them. And our core to our belief is that the issue of environment and climate is not new to human society. It's been there for thousands of years. People have always faced scarcity on food products or having to deal with different climate threats and things like that. And almost all cultures and civilizations have some philosophical concepts on how to relate to the environment. And they are sometimes different, sometimes there is a similarity between them, but it's those we need to nurture and promote and encourage civil society to take ownership of the impending issues that we face as human beings. Yes, so that in a nutshell is what the Sikh Human Rights Group does. And we are fortunate to have some excellent workers working on this who understand the systems and are promoting this.
Dr. Jasdev Rai, thank you very much for that. So the way that the podcast is going to work from now on is I'm going to ask you a few questions on environmental matters, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Bethan, who is a diversity officer here at Sikh Human Rights Group, and she's going to ask some questions on diversity. So can I begin with Professor Kaya and asking, why are Indigenous people and traditional knowledge systems so vital to protecting our future global biodiversity?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. If you look at the indigenous communities all over the world, they depend on the biodiversity and the natural environment for their basic needs in terms of health and well-being. That's why you find our institute here and our center in particular is putting emphasis on the issue of traditional medicine and food security and environmental management, because they depend on the environment and its biodiversity for all the basic needs, including nutrition, food security, shelter, environmental management. So, including the issue of land. In indigenous communities, land is not just a physical thing, it has spiritual implications. That's why here in South Africa, when people were forced removed from their ancestral land where their ancestors are buried, it had a big implication for their lives, not just the physical aspect that they couldn't grow their basic needs, but they also deprived from their spiritual needs. So their symbiotic and interdependent relationship with the natural environment and biodiversity, including associated knowledge system, because biodiversity and culture, environment and culture, they go together, because when you live in a particular ecosystem, you develop particular ideas, particular innovations, particular spiritual relationship to that particular diversity. In other words, the way of life goes together with the ecosystem there. So you develop particular knowledge systems, and this makes indigenous communities as custodians of indigenous knowledge, and they have a stake in protecting its survival and its sustainability, because without the environment, they can't survive. And that is a global implications in the sense that their behavior and to the environment, as Rai was pointing out, in the sense that the relationship between humans and, in this case, indigenous communities to the environment is culturally specific. And that's why we came with the idea that you cannot universalize environmental values and ethics, because they are culturally specific. If you want somebody to preserve and protect the environment, you must also take into consideration how they're related to the environment. So indigenous communities are very important regarding to biodiversity and indigenous knowledge, in the sense that they are custodians, because they have a stake. If the environment is tempered or is destroyed, it means you are destroying their lives. So they are the ones who ensure that the environment is protected. And another important aspect is the fact that when you look at the issues of climate change and biodiversity and indigenous knowledge systems and with the communities, is the fact that indigenous communities over the years in their relationship with the environment and biodiversity, they have developed specific knowledge of the behavior of natural phenomena, plants, animals, insects, wind, as early warning systems to climate change. So if the environment is destroyed or is distorted or whatever happens to the environment, it means also it impacts on their knowledge systems and how they adapt and mitigate their lives in relation to the environment. So you find that they are the custodians of these knowledge systems. And that's why if you also destroy the environment, biodiversity, you destroy their lives, and they make sure that this biodiversity is protected. That's why indigenous communities, they also articulate their concerns about the environment and their lives in the United Nations and the other fora, including what we are doing now to ensure that the biodiversity of the world is protected and everybody has sustainable interest in the protection of biodiversity globally, because it affects everybody.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Kaya. Dr. Rai, is there anything that you, sorry, Dr. Rai, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Professor Kaya sort of summed it up very well, and this is something we felt when we were invited to the UNESCO attempts to create a universal ethics of environment. And I put it in context. We looked at all the conventions created by the United Nations, and we felt they were very much a sort of anthropocentric in the way they talked about ownership by human beings, that human society has some sort of a custodianship of the earth and whatever the environment, etc. And it also talked in terms of a fear of the world ending or in catastrophe if we don't take some sort of a responsibility for this. And I pointed out that, look, there are other civilizations who think very differently. You take the Indian civilization, and those people who've not been to university, etc., think that there is a concept of karma. And in Indian civilization, the idea of several universities has existed for a few thousand years, even before modern science hit on it a few hundred years ago. So if you tell the average villager in India and say, the world is going to end in 30 years and we must take ownership of it, the response will be, well, if of the world to finish in 30 years, what is it that I can do? It's beyond my power. And secondly, they will say that my soul will transmigrate to another universe. And so the language we felt of the United Nations conventions didn't talk to at least 1/5 of the world, and we suddenly found that it didn't talk to the majority of the world outside European civilizations. And hence we emphasize the need for, as Professor Kaya says, more culture-specific development of ethical values on promoting relationship between human beings and the environment, and then taking responsibility. There are, for instance, anthropocentric ideas, which is that we, the human beings, are custodians. There are biocentric ideas in some cultures, and there are ecocentric ideas in some cultures. There are cosmocentric ideas in some cultures. In my own belief system, we are only one among the 84 million species in the world on this earth, and we have no more right or claim to resources than, let us say, an ant has, or a giraffe has, or something else has. And therefore, if we approach with some degree of humility, then we also understand our responsibilities and our limitations. And that's what I think. That's why we were quite excited with Professor Kaya's department, and we would like to see this developing in many other countries, a similar sort of institutional setup in universities. So they teach and they try and draw from their indigenous knowledge systems, the traditional systems, traditional knowledge, and make the average person more say engaged in the whole environment, sustainable development, climate issues, as well as being more responsible for what is around them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Professor Kaya, we've touched on this before briefly, but I just want to ask you directly. Do you agree with the following statement? Historically, Indigenous knowledge around protecting biodiversity has largely been ignored by Western science and/or environmental organizations and agencies such as the United Nations, but this is now starting to change.
Yes, I agree. If you look at historically, indigenous knowledge related to biodiversity has been ignored by Western science and environmental organization, and this is due to a number of factors. One, profit motive of Western capitalism and science, using natural resources, especially biodiversity, for profit making. So the marginalization of indigenous cultures and knowledge systems, especially in Africa here, and the associated relationship with the natural environment, including biodiversity, has tended to be ignored. And if you look at also another important aspect is the liberalism, the freedom of the individual. The individual is free to use nature as he or she sees fit, whereas from an indigenous knowledge perspective, we promote the interdependence and the symbiotic relationship between humans and nature, especially the cultural and biodiversity for environmental health care. That if you destroy the environment, this biodiversity, you also destroy the cultural diversity, because those things go symbiotically together. It is out of our relationship with the nature, as I pointed out before, that we develop our knowledge systems, our value systems, spiritual relationship to nature. So there's a symbiotic relationship. So if someone brings a knowledge system which does not respect the biodiversity, or which wants to destroy biodiversity, different forms of deforestation, or through chemical or forms of farming which are environmental not friendly, he is also destroying the cultural diversity. And you see a number of cultures now with modernization, industrialization are being destroyed. Indigenous languages also, which are repositories of knowledge and value systems, the philosophies are disappearing because of destruction of the biodiversity. And also increasing the natural effects of the environment. There is also an increasing realization, because as the environment is being destroyed, you find that also cultures are being destroyed. So everybody now is increasing through globalization, through the impacts of climate change. People become aware that the fate of environmental degradation affects everybody, because climate change affects everybody. Just now with the COVID-19, it affects everybody. Nobody is spared. So this increasing realization also of the environmental degradation and also climate change, and the knowledge which is being embedded in indigenous languages and indigenous communities, people now increasingly realize the importance of indigenous knowledge. That's why even in climate change forums like the COVID, the COP, different types of COP meetings we're having also side meetings of indigenous knowledge. Participating a number of them in Latin America, here in Africa, and in Europe. And you come to realize that there's increasing realization, even among the multinational corporations, that indigenous knowledge associated to climate change, associated to biodiversity, needs to be protected, because human beings across cultures are realizing that there is need to ensure that the biodiversity and environment healthy preservation is important, and the strategies to protect these biodiversity ecosystems, including the associated knowledges, should be shared by everybody. And that's why of all these efforts to share experiences like we are having now, when other people are listening, to see that biodiversity, cultural diversity, and biodiversity as large is an asset. We needed to pull our experiences and knowledge system together to mitigate the impact of environmental destruction and how it affects everybody. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kai. That was really excellent. Dr. Rai, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think we're both sort of emphasizing that there has to be a move away from uniformity, and we can't completely blame the UN or Westernization, because there was a period when colonialism basically ruled the world, and it was inevitable that they would bring one set of thinking and not be very receptive to others at that time. But as things have moved, and the United Nations was also formed very much by Western countries, so there's been a one way of thinking about problems and issues. But increasingly, it's becoming obvious to the United Nations as well that not only environment and climate, but even other issues like conflict, you have to deal with them in very different ways, different cultural nuances come into play. And if you want to be truly a body that represents the world, then you have to represent the diversity, not in just in terms of different nationalities being represented or different races being represented, but also different ideas and philosophies and cultural orientations being incorporated into the way the United Nations works. It's only when we begin to be more comfortable with the pluralism and accept a pluralistic approach that we can succeed. One of the great things that happened at UNESCO was that there was a Professor Darrell Messer who runs his own institution called UBIOS. He was the director there as a consultant, and he encouraged this thinking. And I think it is now beginning to, as Professor Kaya also says, making inroads into several aspects of both the United Nations and world thinking. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. This will be the last question that we have today on environmental matters. But Professor Kaya, is there one small thing that we could all do in our global society to push large environmental organisations and agencies towards further protecting and promoting Indigenous knowledge systems around the globe?
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out, that we need to make organizations aware of the importance of diversity, not just biodiversity, but also cultural diversity, because we need also sensitize, even in schools, that we live in different ecosystems, and our cultural ways of thinking, belief systems, value systems are related to our relationship to the environment, and that is culturally and spiritually even specific. So learners, the organizations need to maybe be made aware of that importance of diversity and the way diversity impacts on our relationship to nature, and how also we mitigate climate change, including adaptation. And also in terms of learners' education, because if these value systems and knowledge systems don't have a currency in the educational system, I mean, we can't have sustainability, because the young generations should also know this question of the importance of pluralism, or as we call it, or biodiversity and the cultural diversity, so that they can relate their lived experience to their relationship to nature and to other challenges affecting the world globally, and to mitigate, as we will say here at our center, the disjuncture between learning and living. And also it helps to be the kind of, as we impart, for instance, these value systems in communities, in organizations, in schools, we are creating a new generation of people, especially young people, who become ambassadors to advance this cultural and ecological specificity of diversity, and preserve this knowledge system, and also appreciate the complementarity and democracy of knowledge systems. Because sharing comparative evidence-based and best practices of cases of biodiversity is a very important aspect in education, and also in the way we relate to one another. And the question of NGOs, whatever, and a combination of strategies on how we are going to sensitize them on these aspects, we can use a number of strategies. There are community-based educational awareness programs. We can do different groups of people, organizations, NGOs, public and private organizations, we can come together and develop programs which we can share nationally, locally, and internationally on the importance of biodiversity and cultural diversity in the terms of best practices, because different cultures from different ecosystems develop different best practices, and these should be shared through different forums. And also another strategy which the organizations, schools can learn from on the importance of biodiversity is we use the influencers. You got traditional leadership in local communities who can be influencers. If you can empower them, make them sensitive on the importance of biodiversity in relationship to global challenges, they can also influence other people. Also, we've got the social media now. Young people like yourself and others, you're conversant with ICTs, different digital platforms, and these can be used as strategies of sensitizing different sections of society, locally, nationally, and internationally on the importance of biodiversity. And also another important aspect is to build local, national, international partnerships, just as we are doing now. I've been working with right now with the Daryl Mesa and the other people across to build a partnership so that we share people with a shared vision and mission on biodiversity. How do we come together? That's how we, since 2012, myself, Rai, Daryl Mesa, and the other colleagues across the globe, we've been working together to ensure that we promote these values of the significance of diversity in terms of culture and ecosystems. So organizations across the globe, communities, schools, educational systems can learn a lot out of these aspects of biodiversity. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, you've nicely brought it into questions more on diversity now. So I'll bring it to Dr. Rai and have more of kind of a Sikh philosophy approach. So Dr. Rai, how would you present the importance of learning about Sikh philosophy at schools and university level when tackling issues of diversity around the globe?
Well, I think I wouldn't want to convert anybody, so let me be clear first. But there are aspects of the Sikh philosophy which go back into Indian philosophy as well. It's the idea of accepting pluralism as the most natural phenomenon of human society and the world around us. There is one of the essential statements both in other Indian thought systems and essential to the Sikh philosophy is that there is one truth, but nobody knows that truth, and there are many ways of approaching it and understanding it. So by that statement, it enables us to be pluralistic and accept different ways of thinking about that truth. And since nobody knows it, that means that is what science in the end is still struggling to find out what is the ultimate knowledge, that scientists often come up with. They've come up with the finite solution now, what started the world, what started the universe, etc. And then they find there are other questions rising from that. So we've always believed that there are truths, but nobody really knows what those truths are, and we can only and it's not just a matter of intellectualizing truth, but there are things like intuition, experiences, and other phenomena by which very few people ultimately realize it. And there's another statement that the person who can articulate truth probably hasn't understood the truth. So the idea is that human language and human thought is limited, and we cannot really convey some very difficult concepts. I mean, how many people understand Einstein's theory, let alone the latest theories of physics? Even most physicians, people in the branch of advanced physics don't understand what they're talking about. They say we are making these ideas, but we don't clearly understand them. So the truth is often very elusive. From that, we accept pluralism, and I think if the world begins to appreciate that rather than being dogmatic about ideas, we need to accept that there are many ways of thinking even the same problem, or even people around us, and we have to be more accepting, not just tolerating, but accepting of different ways of cultural thinking, different ways of perceiving the world around us. As long as we have some sort of dignity and respect for each other, we will thrive in diversity rather than trying to push towards conformity.
Great, thank you. And this question, I will kind of sum it up, and it's for both of you. So I'll start with Professor Kaya, but is there any advice you would give NGOs or activists who are vigorously trying to pursue change for their community and improve diversity and representation? Obviously, in the last 12 months, we've seen a lot of peaceful protests around the globe. And is there kind of another approach that you would recommend for people to try to implement change or representation?
Yeah, I think I've already pointed that you can use a combination of strategies, and one of them I said it is develop community-based educational knowledge awareness programs which demonstrate the best diversity, comparative examples of best cases of across cultures where people can learn the importance of biodiversity and cultural diversity together. As I said, those things go together, you can separate them. And another thing I pointed out before, that you can use a lot of influencers. In our case, where a majority of people live in traditional societies, use traditional leadership, because these people have a kind of moral authority, and people across generations respect them. So if they can embrace the importance of diversity, as I said, we shouldn't just concentrate on biodiversity, also the issue of cultural diversity goes together. We are talking about the question of preserving the environment and against universalization of ethics are cultural specific. So there are influencers in society, traditional leadership, and now in the modern world now, we have social media. It's very important where, especially among the young people, yeah, we can influence them through the social media, things which they relate to directly and mostly. So how do you use the social media to impart knowledge and awareness on the issue of diversity in relation to climate change? Remember the first time when we met, you said yourself, and we were pursuing that as a project, which we can communicate with you in the near future, that how do we sensitize young people on the relationship between biodiversity and climate change? It's a very important aspect. How do you use your skills and knowledge on ICTs to sensitize young people, especially in communities, in NGOs, in all organizations, on the importance of diversity and climate change? And also, it is pointed also, I'm just repeating what I said, we need to be the partnerships. What we are doing now is a form of partnerships. How do we work together across races, across cultural, spiritual relationships, because we live in the same world, although we have different cultural orientations and affiliations. But how do we bring partnerships across cultural diversity, ecosystems, ideological persuasions to ensure that we preserve diversity, and looking at diversity as an asset, not as a problem? That when people look at common problems like COVID-19, climate change, and other global challenges, we bring our knowledge systems, diverse knowledge systems together. It is something very positive. So there are different ways, influencers, issues of partnerships, and other strategies which bring people together to share experiences, best practices to preserve and promote diversity, both culture and biology.
Great, thank you. Do you want to add anything as well?
Yeah, I think I think Professor Kaya used the word complementarity, and I think we are not in sort of silos of different cultures, but we need to respect different cultures, but also they complement each other. I think nature is full of diversity, and sometimes what we get too obsessed with is the idea of scientific and technological knowledge, and tend to forget that science and technology don't have ethics. They are just systems of perceiving the mechanistic part of the what is going around us. Technology is there to assist human beings. As technology doesn't have ethics, it is human beings who create ethics, it's cultures who create ethics, and science and technology are not creative in the sense, it's human beings who are creative. And in that creativity is where sometimes our violence rise and where we learn to respect each other. It's in our creativity that we produce great culture orientations, or we try and become narrow-minded and try and impose conformity. I think if we realize that the greatest asset human beings have is the ability to create, to be creative. Cultures are in the end creative constructions, and that's what makes us exciting. That's what makes us human beings. And therefore we learn from each other. We not only learn from each other, but we also respect each other's value systems. And if you look at the nature around us, it's full of creativity. You know, the science of a plant growing or a tree growing is the same, but you have some trees which have to grow very tall to get nutrients, and other trees which grow in very dark spaces to get nutrients. So the universe around us is full of this sort of cultural differences and variations and diversity. And I think we need to be more accepting, more pluralistic in our approach. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both Professor Hassan Kaya and Dr. Jasdev Rai. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it at home. Please watch our social media platforms for next month's edition. That would be Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. But now have an excellent day, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you
Very much.
Thank you.